Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to this special interview with Mr. Danny Mackie. He's an expert in international relations and co-founder of Syrian Youth in Britain, based in London.
Hi,
Mr. Mackie, welcome to our interview.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We'll start by asking you about the reason behind your visit.
Well, basically, the reason behind my visit was twofold. First of all, to show that Syria is safe, and it is not how it is being portrayed in certain media outlets. We had an aim to come here to promote dialogue, to promote stability, to promote peace, and to ultimately show the world that there has to be a kind of political solution which is based on Syrian people who want the best for Syria, and that it is not a bad place to come, in a sense that we came here, it was safe, and we came here of our own accord, and we're completely independent. And we came here to Damascus, and it's been lovely so far. It's been safe and secure, and we seek to start a political solution to define the concept of peace and stability and how we can work for a better future and how we can work to solve the ongoing crisis, which has obviously been so predominant throughout the last 2 years.
So I can understand that you came with your group, some of your group from the youth gathering?
I came with some. I came with another person, in fact, who came to promote peace and dialogue. The main aim to come here is to build stronger relations, especially with the Syrian media, to show the people that we have a voice outside of Syria. There are Syrians who live abroad who are willing to be part of the setup for the political solution, and who are willing to really spread the truth about what is happening in Syria, and not just to take one stance or another, but to really show that there is a voice which needs to be heard, and that is the voice of the so-called silent majority within Syria, those people who really have no say in the Western media or in the Arab media, which has been as badly influencing as the Western media, in fact. So
what's the reason behind this misconception about what's going on in Syria, and how much of this is our fault and the fault of youth, let's say?
Yes, indeed. They say the first victim of any conflict is always the truth, and this is indeed manifested by the Syria crisis. What we've had is a level of propaganda which has been propagated by a certain state-run media in the Arab world. I don't want to mention names, but everyone knows who they are. They're controlled by states, but they're given the perception that they work within free Arab media when they're truly not. They obviously have a state line, and the state line has been that we seek regime change in Syria. This is the line of the states who provide funding and finance to these media stations. So it is only natural that these media stations, in accord and in tandem with these states, are going to take a line in regards to the Syria crisis, which is we will not show any side of the truth from the government side, or even the middle. We will only show one side of what we consider the truth, which is, of course, we all understand now, it's not the truth. And we will aim to embark on a destabilization campaign within Syria and to create as much chaos, media-wise, as we can, especially within the Arab world. We live in an age of information, an age of globalization, an age where satellite channels have more influence than supranational institutions. We live in an age where states can be destroyed by media, because they say...
Is that the reason behind stopping the broadcasting of some Syrian channels on
yeah, this is certainly
satellites?
I mean, when you have a channel which is showing contrary to what is being showed in the mainstream Arab media, then there's going to be conflict and tension. The main cause, which I think, which is why Syrian media has been taken off some certain air stations and shows, is because it shows what many people in Damascus believe, and this is not in the interest of Arab states, regional powers, or certain Arab-owned media, which is Gulf-owned, the majority of it, to show this, because it's contrary to what they're saying, and it reveals a level of truth which isn't shown by the mainstream media. So when you have Syrian media, which has been attacked since the beginning of the crisis. Now, Syrian media, we have to differentiate here, because it started off quite slow, to be honest, but there has been reporting on issues which you can't find anywhere else. I mean, we've noticed a large improvement within the Syrian media over the last year. This has been manifested by the embedding of journalists within the army, of more open-air debates and open-air talks. You can openly criticise the government on television nothing's going to happen because it does have a level of democracy and freedom within the media. However, this just isn't represented in some of the Western mainstream media outlets. They consider Syrian media as out of reality, as just a channel based on propaganda. But the truth is, there are Syrian people who are working within Syrian media, and they're not propagandists. They are Syrians who believe in a democratic, free Syria, but are against what's happening. Because what is happening is clearly an effort, an operation for regime change, which is externally imposed, not just internally. And they can see that there is a large portion of the truth which is just not being reached to the outside world. This is why we don't really have the Syrian media as a source for referencing. In terms of the Syria crisis, the most referenced source is Associated Press.
Yes.
And Reuters. I mean, Reuters, as soon as they have an article on Syria, it's quoted by almost every single media outlet and station all across the world, because media is controlled by the few. And it can make, as Malcolm X said, it can make the kind of the oppressor, can make the oppressed seem like the oppressor. And this is true because in regards to Syria, there is common consensus that it is not necessarily a struggle between one person and a country. It is a struggle between a state and other states who are seeking the destruction of one state through inadvertent means. Now, this is where we have to differentiate between what's happening in Syria as an internal matter and what is happening in Syria as a proxy war, which is fought by proxy through regional powers.
What can we do about that?
The Syrian media has a massive role to play in terms of revealing certain truth, especially the elements, external elements, which are present in probably rebel-held areas or within Syria, internally speaking, because it's very hard for Western journalists to be embedded with the Syrian army because they have this perception that the Syrian media only allows one line, which is not necessarily true because there is it is kind of outwards in a sense. I think that the importance of the Syrian media, especially within the Syrian crisis, is fundamental, as it has to show its own public that what is happening is completely different to what you're being shown by different channels. It's not to say that one side is right or another is wrong, but it's a sense of part of the truth isn't coming up. The biggest problem with other media outlets is not that they're being so extreme in what they show on Syria, it's that they completely misinform the other side. It's easy for me to say, okay, look, I am anti-government and I'll have a line which is anti-government, but at the same time I'll show elements of pro-government issues which shows, okay, this is two sides, because it's not necessarily deemed as an uprising anymore, and it never was, but now it's classed as a conflict. Now, in a conflict, the rules and the forces, media forces, political forces, economic forces, social forces, they change, because the terminology used is different. When you discuss a war and a conflict, it's different when you discuss a so-called uprising against an authoritarian government, which is clearly nothing of the sort. You discuss an issue which has two sides, two warring sides. Now, when you show only one side and completely disinform the other side and don't show anything from the other side, what you're doing is you're committing a crime, a media crime, which is concealing a large section of the truth. This is what we've seen in Syria, and this is what Syrian media really has to work on. Having more relations with other media outlets, more relations with journalists, doing more interviews, showing that, look, we're not an intransigent institution. We believe in democracy, but we just understand that what is happening is not how it's being presented elsewhere. Like, I'm in Damascus, and for anyone who'd read into the lines of any Western media outlets, Arab media outlets, they'd think this was something out of hell. But I came here in the most safe and secure manner possible, and I'm here, and I haven't seen anything to worry anyone so far. So when I'm here seeing this firsthand, it's in essence a reality check, because what we're seeing is a country which is relatively stable in terms of Damascus. Obviously other areas are different, but it is not exactly how it is being perceived externally. And this is where we have to differentiate between the internal struggle and the external struggle. Propaganda is always an issue in conflict. And as Lenin said, if you repeat a lie often enough, it often becomes a truth.
Exactly.
And this is what happened in Syria. They kept on repeating the same course, that, okay, this is an uprising and this is peaceful. And they repeated this for about a year and a half until, look, the Western media outlets saw what's happening and even Sky News, they came to a prison in Syria, they interviewed Jabhat al-Nusra, they can understand that, okay, these people are radical, they're extremists, they have no relation to democracy, and it is now very clear and coherent for the entire world to see that there's two sides to this conflict, and the side which
one is being shown
and the other
everywhere.
one is not being, and this is in itself, I said, it's a crime. And one side is being glorified. Now there is a difference between giving something, you can't intervene in Mali and use the terminology of terrorists, whilst interview radical Islamists in Syria and use the term freedom fighters.
Exactly.
Because
we'll talk about the Mali issue in a while. But I want to focus now on the Syrian crisis and the proposed plan by the Syrian government to get Syria out of this crisis. What do you think about the plan and the 6 points that Mr. President mentioned?
Well, certainly, and conspicuously speaking, it's a step forward. It's a sign in the right direction. It's progress in a sense. It shows that the Syrian government is not taking the path of other more intransigent governments. It wants peace, it wants dialogue, it wants a solution which is a Syrian-led political solution, one which can act as a catalyst for some sort of dialogue between the different warring parties, whether it's externally or internally. It's definitely a peace plan which should be considered, especially by lots of opposition figures, because it's, essentially speaking, they want dialogue. The Syrian government has said openly that we do not want this crisis to continue forever. There has to be a solution. And Syria is the victim. A government can also be a victim, the opposition can be a victim. At the end of the day, it's the people who are victimised in this. They're the people, they're the refugees, and it is nowhere near the opposition's interest for this to continue. Because if this continues, they won't have a chance to have their regime change operation, because signs are showing that there will be no collapse in Syria. There hasn't been, and there is a level of political stability within Syria now, in a sense that we can't have the same example we had in Iraq or Libya, because intervention is impossible, and it's essentially an internal struggle, which would finish if some of the regional powers stopped funding and arming the opposition.
Exactly.
A step in the right direction in the sense that it can act as probably a conduit for change. We can agree that there has to be some sort of transition. Look, transition is a must. Without transition, we can't get anywhere. Elections in 2014, this is also a step in the right direction, one which should be considered by all parties. We heard Lavrov spoke a few weeks ago after the president's speech, saying that this is an issue which we support the political solution, and we support any initiative, whether it's by the Syrian government or not by the Syrian government, which wants an end to this current Syria crisis.
And if it's peacefully?
It has to be done peacefully, firstly. Second of all, it has to be a regional solution. We can discuss the fact that it has to be Syrian-led by Syrian groups with the Syrian government, and it has to respect the sovereignty of Syria. There has to be a stop to all funding of armed groups, of extremist radical groups, of movements by all regional powers. The borders have to be secure. There has to be a phase of negotiations. There can be
national dialogue
on a national scale, whether it's here in Damascus, whether even if this is an issue, we could do it in other countries. There are lots of countries who have had a very moderate and objective stance in the Syria crisis. Such countries as India, South Africa, Venezuela, even China. These states can all act as potential places where there can be a dialogue between Syrians. Because I really think it's time now that this conflict can be militarized no longer. It has to be done in a sense that there needs to be a synergy for peace, a mechanism which allows both sides to really sit down and have a negotiated settlement. Look, every conflict, every war, every crisis always ends with a solution. We've seen this throughout history, whether it's the Vienna Convention ended the Napoleonic Wars, whether it's the Treaty of Versailles ended the First World War, the Taif Agreement which ended the Lebanese Civil War. There is always a peace plan or an agreement which ends a crisis in a country. We don't want this crisis to continue for another 10 years.
It seems that they refuse to end the crisis peacefully, and they refused the proposed plan by the Syrian government. Why do you think they are refusing to get Syria out of the crisis peacefully?
I think now it is very important that any factions, possibly within the opposition, who reject a political settlement and a peaceful solution are essentially calling for war. They're calling for the continuation of the crisis. They're calling for more disaster, more destruction, more refugees.
How would this reflect on their agendas on their agenda in the region?
The fact that they're in the West, supported by the West, and all they seem to do is ask for more arms, money, ammunition. People hold conferences for them. People hold all sorts of meetings, and they put faith in the Syrian National Council, the coalition, that it would be a government in waiting, like Iraq. But this is clearly not happening, as there are very severe and significant fragmentations inside the Syrian opposition, between the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, the so-called leftist side, which is essentially causing it to disintegrate. It doesn't matter how much you can give them, weapons, arms, anything, but so long as they're not in Syria, they're outside of Syria, they have no real interests or influence in the ground, in a sense that they can't control the military groups who are fighting, they have no say over the armed opposition whatsoever, and they continue to reject dialogue. So in a sense, they're blocking a political solution. Now, it is very hard to say whether they have their own sovereignty in making decisions, considering the fact that they're funded by certain states. These states ultimately have an element of domination over them. I mean, it's interest that I'm not going to fund the group without asking for something in return. And the return is that they want from the Syrian opposition to essentially be an agent in continuing the crisis until Syria is destroyed, until there is no more infrastructure, until you have a complete fall of the state system.
And destroy Syria economically.
They're destroying Syria economically in terms of sanctions, which is an issue that we could talk about later.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of the political solution, this is an absolute must. Without a political solution, we're calling for a military solution, which is absolutely disastrous. And the Syrian government has said, we do not believe or agree to a military solution. This has to be done politically, and there has to be a form of, not just a mechanism, but a way forward to end this crisis. There's a Syrian dialogue group which has been formed, who are made up of pro and kind of anti, in the sense that there are people who supported the government and people who are against the government in certain issues. And they formed the Syrian Dialogue Group, which is essentially an arena for talking about different issues, for exchanging ideas, exchanging views, for potentially acting as a theatre for a political solution, as a kind of framework.
Round table.
A roadmap, yeah, where you have Syrians whose main interest is the safety and security of Syria, who want to sit down and look, how can we search to actually find a real palpable solution, one which takes everything into consideration, a comprehensive, legitimate, significant settlement which can act as a barrier, a kind of a mark in the crisis to signify and signal a new era, a new phase. We can't keep having phases of escalating military conflicts and more instability. We need a phase where we have political dialogue, a solution, one which respects not just the sovereignty of Syria, but respects the aspirations of the Syrian people. People have to comprehend that there can be no decision made from outside of Syria. The Syrian people are not subjects to anyone apart from Syrians themselves or Syria as a state. You can't have the Americans calling for regime change. We can't have even Russia, China, these other states. They can support a political solution.
They can give advice, but they cannot order.
They can never instigate a political settlement because they're not Syrian. And this is the issue with al-Akhdar Ibrahimi. Now, I believe that Ibrahimi tried his hardest, as did Kofi Annan, but there's going to be groups who want war in Syria, who are hijacking the peace settlement, the peace process and the peace settlement. Media outlets. Media is very important in this day and age. It is the fourth branch of governments, one which can destroy states, destroy families, completely destroy the truth, in a sense. And they have been very successful in destabilizing the Akhdar Ibrahimi's peace plan, which was legitimate and which was reasonable to an extent. What we need a phase where we can get both opinions and find consensus, find a point where both sides can agree and work around it. There can be no preconditions in any political solution. Precondition which is set essentially kills, it's stillborn, it becomes kind of aborted already, because you set a rule of guidelines, certain issues that you want to discuss before entering negotiations. No side will ever enter negotiations in the history of the human race from a position of profound weakness. Both sides at the phase of negotiations enter from a position of strength where, like, okay, we need this, and in return, we want a transitional phase, seats in parliament. We want Syria to be a perfectionist democracy with numerous political parties. There has to be a ceasefire. Of course, we can discuss the political solution until the sun comes over, but there has to be ceasefire. The military situation on the ground has to be resolved. Lots of people have discussed the issue of sending observers, military observers. Initially, I was against the fact that there should be observers, but to an extent, this is an issue which could be considered. Observers from countries like Russia or China, South Africa, countries who don't have a politicized stance in the Syria crisis, can act as an excellent theatre and an arena for a political solution, which is based on having kind of areas where a ceasefire is negotiated. These are all the issues which can be discussed in future stages. But I think without having a political solution, we're calling for an anarcho state, a destruction of all of the state institutions, essentially not just a Syrian war, but a regional war.
Of course, because Syria is the key figure.
It's the linchpin of the region, and to an extent, what happens in Syria won't stay in Syria. Syria's historical geographic location within the Middle East, and the fact that it is the heart of kind of ideological Arabism. It's probably, Damascus is the oldest inhabited capital in the world. That speaks a magnitude of words which I can't speak myself. The strategic importance of Syria is so significant that this is why we see Syria on the news in every single country, every single day, because Syria's location is so important. The stability of Syria is so important that states just can't not discuss the issue of Syria. And you know, Syria was the 4th safest country in the world in 2004.
Yes.
It was a country
where this crisis lead Syria after it had that rank in terms of security and stability?
To an extent, people take security for granted. When someone lives within a phase of security...
Exactly. I wanted to ask you in regard to the Syrian people in the first place.
The Syrian people, I have nothing but good things to say about the Syrian people. I would like to speak about ideologies in a sense that Syria is a very stable, secure country, very hospitable people, very friendly people. I mean, even Westerners and other non-Syrians who visited only speak good about the Syrian people, how excellent Damascus is, how historical it is, how much potential it has, not just in the region, but as the linchpin of the whole. Kind of, if you take a map of the world, Syria is in the middle. It's the location of Syria is so crucial in a regional sense, and even internationally. This is why you have a global struggle in terms of Syria. The Syrian people are not extremist. The Syrian people have never been extremist. They are a proud people, one which admire their own history, their culture, their heritage. The fact that Syria is one of the most historically important countries in the world speaks volumes, of course. The Syrian people have always been a hub of resistance to any external kind of aggressive movements, the hub of resistance to the Ottoman Empire, the hub of resistance to the colonial French, who are also seeking an age of post-colonialism within Syria and the Arab world, which is manifested by recent interventions.
They are trying to regain their colonies.
And the issue of resistance is that there's always been a sense that it's always been a popular resistance to foreign aggressors, always having this sense of the fact that I'm proud of my culture, my heritage, my society, the fact you have this peaceful coexistence within Syria, this diverse socio-ethnic, socio-political formation and structure, which is so unique in the Middle East, which you only have in Syria, where you have sects and religions and different from minorities and majorities living with each other, where religion, race, culture, ethnicity has never been an issue. Syria has taken refugees from Lebanon, from Palestine, from Iraq, from all corners of the Arab world. Syria has always had a hand in almost every conflict in the Arab world, which has been fighting a foreign aggressor. From Libya against the Italians, to Algeria against the French, to Palestine. Can't forget
exactly
the
about the Palestinians. I want to ask you, what is the purpose of displacing the Palestinians for the second time by the Europeans? The first time from their homeland, from their own homeland, and now from Syria. Here I refer to Al Yarmouk camp, where it's well known that Palestinians live there. Why? How can the Europeans correct this historical mistake?
They can't. It's impossible. It's an issue which has been of unprecedented significance. The fact that it has partitioned an entire region. We had Sykes-Picot, we had the Balfour Declaration within the 1920s, and before that. What this did, this carved up the Arab world. It destroyed any chances the Arab world had of being a unified bloc of power, economically or politically, even ideologically. What the West have been successful in is using the typical imperialist strategy of divide and conquer. They've divided the Arab world, they've partitioned it. And what they've done is they've put governments and regimes into power in the Middle East, which are formed by the British and the French hundreds of years ago. Examples in the Gulf, possible example in Jordan if you want. These are all regimes of government who have had historical alliances with the West because their grandfathers, and even before that, were put in place by Western powers. So how can we expect loyalty from these countries towards the Arab causes, or to even have an objective viewpoint from the Syria crisis, when their grandfathers have been placed into power by the British and the French in an age of colonialism and imperialism and brutality? People often forget history, which is also the biggest indicator to the future. The British killed tens of thousands of Syrians and Palestinians. The French killed even more. We've had a region which has been fighting Western imperialism and domination for the last 60, 70, 80 years before that. What we have now, we have a new phase of imperialism and domination, which is perpetrated by certain Western states to exert hegemony over the Arab world, using Syria, seeing as Syria is the conduit of the region, it is the heart of the region. Ideologically, it is the heart of fervent Arab nationalism. This is why Palestine will always remain, no matter what happens in Syria, it will always remain the sole Arab cause and the most important foreign policy cause for the whole of the Syrian population. This has been historically, and this will remain, of course.
And they'll keep. It's in the blood of the Syrians.
It's in the blood of the Syrians. And if I could just elaborate on one issue, the issue of Al Yarmouk camp. The Palestinians are a people who have been under oppression and dictatorship, tyranny by the Israeli regimes for the last probably 60, 70 years. Hundreds of thousands have fled. Millions live in the neighboring Arab countries. Their phase is so difficult that the last thing they needed was to leave their second home, which is Syria. And this is what's been done. Lots of media outlets, lots of countries have really tried to reiterate the point of bringing the Palestinians into the Syria crisis. Even the Palestinian groups, some which are under external pressure, some which remained loyal, they've always said, even Mahmoud Abbas, I have my reservations, but he stated that there should be no real Palestinian conflict within the Syria crisis. This is a completely non-inextricably intertwined issue. There is no relation between the Syria crisis and Palestine. This is what some of the Western countries have really aimed at doing, targeting this social formation in Syria, where you have Palestinians who, may I say, even treated better than Syrians on occasions, who have been given jobs, housing, everything they'd wished for in life.
Treated as Syrians.
Treated as Syrians, as Syrian citizens. Many of them have Syrian citizenship. Many of them are treated very well, not just by the state, by the people. This is the brotherhood between the Syrian population and between the Palestinians. This is something which we wish will remain forever, as Palestine is the sole cause of the Arabs and should always be. And there can be no peace and stability in the Arab world while you have Israel, which is probably the most tyrannical and dictatorial country in the whole of the Arab world. Of course, they say it's the most successful democracy, but no democracy can give its people a good life whilst oppressing people outside of its borders. So this is the hypocrisy of Israeli foreign policy as well. Also, Israeli issues within the Syria crisis is very important. How they wanted to use the Syrian Palestinians, who have always been a hub of resistance, use them as kind of, okay, we want this regime to change in Syria. This is their perception, what they say. We want the Palestinians in Syria to be supportive of a potential peace settlement with Israel. This is why we saw the Israeli ambassador in the United States of America, who discussed on national television in America that he would rather al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra rule Syria than the Syrian-led, kind of Assad-led government, because they fear Hezbollah and the resistance axes more than they fear al-Qaeda. Because, historically speaking, al-Qaeda have never attacked Israel. They have never destroyed Israeli interests. In fact, al-Qaeda...
But they will turn.
they will turn against them, but they view the Syrian government at this current moment of time as more of a threat than al-Qaeda.
Than al-Qaeda, yeah.
And this is a very significant issue. And the Palestinians, they have their place in Syria. And what has been happening in Yarmouk, with especially some of the armed groups which have come in and really tried to focus on the point of having Palestinian conflict within the Syria crisis, kind of a conflict within a conflict, is absolutely it's reprehensible, and it is something which they will pay the price for in the future, because Palestinian Syrians, they're not likely to submit to the West or have good relations with Israel. They remain a hub of resistance and a hub of loyalty to Syria. And this is very important. And this is one issue which people are failing to address. The loyalty of the Palestinians to Syria and their acknowledgement and appreciation to Syria and what it's done for the Palestinian cause, where no other Arab state has done more for Palestine than Syria. And this isn't me saying this, it is the Palestinians saying this. So Syria's commitment to Palestine will remain eternal, I think, in my opinion.
I want to ask you, I don't know if you have seen the report on Al Mayadeen news channel a few days ago that showed very clearly the terrorists and the armed men sneaking from the occupied Syrian Golan into the borders, into the Syrian land, into Syria, under the sight of Israelis and UN soldiers. How would such an act, a shameful act, reflect on the prestige of the international community?
The fact that this hasn't been covered to the extent it has to be covered in the international community conveys its significance, in a sense, because the Arab media, and especially the uprising Arab people, should see that literally some of the armed groups in Syria are working under the auspice of Israel within the border areas. What they're doing is they're the third party in Syria who's creating tension between both of the warring sides and essentially creating issues, regionally speaking. We've seen this with Israel, we've seen this with Turkey, and this is continuing until now. And I saw the report on Al Mayadeen, and it shows very, very, very clearly attacks which are happening from within the Israeli borders. And it's very clear for anyone to see. It's online as well, it's on YouTube, that armed groups are using Israel to attack the Syrian army from inside Israeli territory. Not just destroying all the conventions and the demilitarized zone and going against all the UN agreements,
all the treaties,
disobeying international law and the treaties, but also trying to create a war, an issue between Israel and Syria, using the Israeli side in coordination with the Israeli government. And this is very clear for anyone who watched the report. It's very clear the level of coordination needed for such attacks would only come from within Israel. And come on, Israel is the most security-based country in the world. It is very, very, very inconceivable that they would not pay attention to armed groups working within their borders when they have surveillance drones, they have cameras. They're one of the biggest systems in terms of surveillance and monitoring in the whole of the world. It is essentially a military state. And they could clearly see the rebels using Israel to attack Syria, but they did nothing about it. Because what they want regime change in Syria. They don't mind if the rebels use the Israeli borders. As long as the Syrian government is ousted, then Israel will be happy. But contrary to what they're viewing and contrary to what's happening, the Syrian government is more stable and secure than what most people think and what most people have been saying for the last 2 years. And the issue of Israel, and especially Israeli security, has been one of the major factors behind the US foreign policy in Syria, which has acted as a catalyst for the United States for sanctioning the Syrian people, for arming the radical groups and the movements, even when they waged a 10-year war of terror it was, against the Arab people, against Islam, using the name of al-Qaeda. They're now directly aligned to the most radical, extremist, ideologically insane groups in the whole of the region inside of Syria. So this is the ultimate hypocrisy of Western foreign policy. When you say you fight against al-Qaeda for numerous years, yet you support the same groups inside of Syria
Exactly.
This is not political support.
That's
this is
what's
real
happening
military
here
support.
And in Mali now.
In Mali as well.
Exactly.
This is an issue which I'd really like to focus on.
Yes, you can elaborate more on this issue, because we should mention to our viewers that it's the same organization, Al-Qaeda. Terrorist groups there are now fighted by the French and British army, but here in Syria they are funded and helped, and they are called rebels.
It's kind of the devil's advocate, isn't it? In a sense that what they do in Syria is you have the phase of the notion of good terrorists, and in Mali they're bad terrorists. Even though the level of terrorism which is being committed in Syria on a day-to-day basis is at least 1,000 more times more dangerous than what is perpetuated and perpetrated by certain groups in Mali or Algeria recently with the hostage issue. So what you have is an unethical Western foreign policy, one which is based on interests rather than values. And this has created significant problems within Western society. That you have some people, and especially the majority of the people, are comprehending that, okay, this is a real change here. How can you really fight terrorism in Mali but allow terrorism to continue in Syria, when we can clearly see that what is happening in Syria is not a secular democratic opposition. These are figures who are demanding an Islamic State. These are people who have been using the most barbaric and brutal forms of execution, things which have been unknown and unprecedented in the Arab world. Al-Nusra Front, which is essentially an al-Qaeda affiliated group, has been guilty of some of the biggest terrorist explosions in the Middle East over the last probably 10 to 20 years. And initially, this was dismissed as this is Syrian government propaganda. But now, when they can see that al-Nusra is there, and they've interviewed them, and they can see how deadly and potent they are, they're being glorified. I read an article the other day, probably in Reuters, which said that al-Nusra are a disciplined fighting force. How can you refer to the brothers of al-Qaeda, and they themselves they say they are, as a disciplined fighting force? This is essentially glorifying one of the most extremist movements in the world.
It's double standards.
It's not just double standards, it's a true unequivocal hypocrisy, one which is displayed not just on an international scale, but historically we haven't really had this. Perhaps the biggest example of this was in Afghanistan, where they created al-Qaeda and to fight the Russians, and then when the Russians left, al-Qaeda turned against them, and they waged a 10-year war against al-Qaeda in the name of terror, and used it to further political interest in the region. The issue about Jabhat al-Nusra is that you had initially the Syrian flag, which we all know and love. Then you had the independence flag, which some people accepted, okay, they're opposition figures, they have a right to display their opinions. Then you had the emergence of the black flag, which is the Islamist flag, which is the only flag used by al-Qaeda. So we've had a development here. This is not a secular democratic opposition. This is a radical, extremist, Islamist opposition which seeks an Islamic State. Now, this is not being presented this way in the West, even though all the reports, all the sources signify that al-Nusra and their radical brothers seek a true Islamic State, and this is incompatible with Syria's rich, ethnic, diverse socio-political structure. You can't have a state which is the hub of kind of ethnic living and coexistence and kind of the sense that you have
peaceful manner.
Not just a peaceful manner, but you have it's a rarity. It's rare that you see in the most volatile region, which is the Middle East, a country like Syria, where you have a level of peace and stability, but a level of brotherhood between all the different sects and ethnicities which have been here coexisting for thousands of years. Now, this is an issue which lots of people have attacked, from externally speaking, media outlets, regional countries, where they've used the stigma, the notion that the Syrian government is a constellation of only minorities. They use the term majority, yet when the actual biggest cities are Aleppo and Damascus, which are inhabited by the majority, who have shown the most support for the government. So this is completely contrary to what they're presenting. So it's issues like this which are being covered up, which allow for the situation in Syria to be deteriorated in a media sense, where you have people who consider what is happening as a disaster. In areas it is a disaster, but in general it is not as it's being portrayed. And there are always two sides to every story. And the issue with Jabhat al-Nusra and the intervention in Mali is that the intervention in Mali is not new. This has been considered for lots of weeks and months on end, because the people in the north of Mali are people who supported the revolution in Libya against Gaddafi. Now what happened is that when the revolution in Libya finished, or the NATO aggression finished, they came back to Mali and created extremist Islamist groups with arms, who are funded and armed by certain regional powers.
Because such
Libya,
groups, they just live on this. If you give them money and arms, they cannot live in another way.
They're essentially mercenaries in a sense. So what happened in Mali was that you had an aggression from the north of Mali, held by the pro-Libya rebels, against the government of Mali. Now the government of Mali was an ally of Gaddafi, the same person who the West ousted militarily. So what the West are doing now is defending the same government which supported Gaddafi. So how this is so complex. How does this really work out? So you defend an ally of Gaddafi when you wanted Gaddafi gone. This is the true hypocrisy of Western foreign policy, where even Obama now stated within the last probably 3 days that this is not a short-term intervention. This will go on for 10 and 15, probably 20 years. This is a larger scale regional struggle by the West and their regional allies to destroy al-Qaeda and extremism in North Africa, seeing as they contributed to it by intervening in Libya. They contributed to it in Egypt. What's happened is the Arab Spring, which is not an Arab Spring, it is an Islamist Spring, which was instantly recognized by the West as an excellent political opportunity, not just to further political interest, but to destroy the fragile peace in the region and to get rid of lots of governments which they didn't like. Now the issue with Syria is that it's not necessarily new. The West have had not just hesitancy and a cautiousness with Syria, but a true and outright kind of adversity with the Syrian government for the last 40 years. Because Syria has not been a state which has submitted to the Western domination and the continued imperialism by the West. It's in a state which essentially acted from its own accord, taken strong stances in all of the Arab conflicts, and said we oppose anything which is against the Arab world and the Arab nation. We support the sovereignty, the freedom, the aspirations of the Arab people without Western aggression. They recognize that imperialism and colonialism are issues which are dead, they can never return, and they will have no future in Syria.
Right. I would like to speak a little bit about the double standards of the international community. When the London attacks in 2005 occurred, there were almost 56 people who were killed. Yet, a few days ago or a week ago, there were the attacks on Aleppo University here in Syria. And these attacks, the people who were killed were almost 90 people, if not more. And more than 160 people were wounded. And the attacks of London on that time took the condemnation of all the international community. When the Russian asked for a condemnation from the UN on the attacks of Aleppo, the only country, or the first country that stood against releasing such a statement was Britain. What is the reason behind not condemning such a terrorist act that was very clear? Here I want to mention also that between these 90 people who were killed, all of them were civilians and 20 of them were university students, at least 20 of them. So I want to speak about these double standards.
Firstly, I would just like to say that university is a place for learning and knowledge. It's a place for the future of Syria, a place where people can learn different trades, where they enter a new phase in their lives, which essentially creates a populace which is able to work and progress and to benefit Syria. And what's happened, of course, was an absolute disaster. And of course, our hearts go out to the families of those who have lost loved ones. The sheer hypocrisy in what you stated, especially in regards to Britain, is underlined by the fact that they didn't even recognise that it could be an issue perpetrated by armed groups or armed opposition. What they did, they condemned the government and said that this was a government which embarked on this plan and actually did this atrocity, when evidence shows that it was not the government who committed the crime in Aleppo, and it was in fact the opposition. And the fact that they were reluctant to condemn this is in fact a crime in itself.
Exactly.
How can you state that innocent people who are killed in a deadly terrorist explosion? Now, regardless of the Syria crisis, we have to address certain issues and certain events as they happen. We have to differentiate between condemning a terrorist act and having a policy of destabilising a government. Now, the West haven't done this, and I think Britain has a very strange policy in the Syria crisis. And it is not an issue which is being led by Britain. It is an issue which is being led by the United States of America and NATO, where we've had this media sense and this media phenomenon that what happens in Syria is essentially an uprising and that we have to support it. But when you have acts of terrorism which are reprehensible, which destroy people, their lives, their livelihoods, their houses, Syrian society as a whole, it needs condemnation from all of the governments. And this is true hypocrisy in the sense that Britain, when it had its own terrorist attacks to deal with, received support from almost every single state in the world, including Syria, which actually sent kind of condolences to ones who lost their loved ones in the explosions. Britain, as any pragmatic state, should send at least condemnation of the armed groups who've committed this atrocity. It is the least they can do by any standards. And even since the beginning of the Syria crisis, where we had continuous, numerous explosions, car bombs, suicide bombers, the same issues they faced in Iraq, which were happening in Syria and not being given airtime, they've ignored. And they blame it on the government. How can you blame a government which is fighting terrorists from the West? Now, we don't say that they're all terrorists, but when you have someone who's Libyan, or he's from Afghanistan, or Pakistani, not even Arab, who comes to Syria just to kill people, to place a car bomb in a civilian area, how is this person a freedom fighter? It's impossible, it's inconceivable. These people have one mission, which is jihad, which in a sense is wrong.
Jihad against who?
Exactly, this is the issue I want to talk about, because even within the principles of jihad, if you read Islamic history, it's wrong to have jihad between Muslims, and Syria is a Muslim state. How can you wage jihad on a Muslim state? This is absolute, it's lunacy in a sense. And the fact that this is being supported by regional powers, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Qatar, who have a massive hand in what's happening in Syria, through weapons, through funding, through finance, through creating a situation where Syria becomes a theatre for terrorism, where, how can there be any, this is another issue, how can there really be any armed or terrorist groups in Mali? Because you'd think they're all in Syria. Are there any terrorists in the Middle East left to go to Mali? Because we have reports, even al-Assad Ibrahimi stated, over 5,000 foreign militants. This is a kind of watered down report. People say up to 15,000. Western media outlets say 80% of militants in Aleppo are foreign. So this seems more of an invasion than an uprising. And this is what is not being given the same, it's not being given the credibility it deserves, especially in the West, that this is not a Syrian problem, it's a regional problem, where regional countries are trying to create an Iraq-style situation, where we have a sectarian system, destruction of the state. Look at Iraq after the American intervention. It collapsed into 1,000 pieces. No more infrastructure, the economy is controlled by Western powers, and you have a country which has no real future to be a regional power. And
more external debt.
More external debt. Syria is a country which is free from debt. They are in no debt to the West,
yes,
in no debt to the IMF. And the IMF is not just an institution it has been used to destroy governments, and I'm sure our friends in probably Argentina and Venezuela will tell you the same thing. The IMF has created disasters in countries, destroyed countries economically, plundered them, forced people to pay more money in interest than the loans themselves, which is the wrong path in the sense that some Arab countries such as Egypt, they're going directly to the IMF. They're destroying their state sovereignty, they're allowing their countries to be used economically by the West, and they're essentially destroying any kind of sense of economic progression and development which is internal by allowing for Western industries. Like Libya. Libya is essentially, it's a playground for Western companies. It's a playground for Western capitalism. And because Syria does not have a capitalist system which is controlled by the IMF, it is an ideal target for regime change. One which has been thought of for the last 40 years. I could get you statements by major American foreign policy makers 10 years ago, people such as Colin Powell before that, who have stated that we want to change the government in Syria by force if necessary, but it needs to go. So we could argue that, especially after the de-Baathification in Iraq by the Americans, that Syria is a state which has held its head up high in the region, which was in a direct confrontation with the United States of America in 2003. And this is something unprecedented. This isn't Israel, we're in a direct conflict with America in 2003. Because America is destroying Iraq and Syria has a border. So how can there be stability and security in Syria when you have hundreds of thousands of American troops in Iraq? Syria voted against the Libya resolution. Syria is the only Arab state which supported Palestine. And Syria is a state now where it has the potentiality to be a failed state if this crisis continues, which is not in the interest of the opposition, which is why they need to reconsider the issue of Assad's initiative and come to a political agreement. Because what's going to happen if there is no political agreement or political solution is that Syria will become a failed state. And this is what the opposition are working on, because when you have a failed state, it will be perfect for their Qatari funders and friends to complete the reinvestment inside of Syria.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, sorry, just in short, because we are short in time. I would like to speak about the economic crisis. And also I'm sure that you have heard reports about or the interview of the Syrian head of industrial chamber that said in an interview with Russia Today almost 1,000 or more than 1,000 factories in Aleppo alone were dismantled and sold into pieces to Turkey. And also many of the strategic wheat reserve, especially in the southern parts of Syria, were also stolen and sold in Turkey. I would like to speak about this point, and if you think that this is an act done by states or by terrorist groups, small terrorist groups.
No such event can be done by small terrorist groups, because they don't have the capacity, the means, or even the interest to do such a thing. If they have their path of so-called terrorism, it has nothing to do with economic factories, industry. This is an issue which states deal with. And let me say clearly that I was against the good relation with Turkey from the beginning, because I knew that Turkey has interest in Syria, and there's more for Turkey in this than Syria. And that this is a Turkey which is under the auspice of the United States of America, which has very good relations with Israel, and to an extent have wanted to capitalize on Syria, economically speaking, more than any other state. Of course, you have Gulf investment, other Arab states, we have Russia, China, you have very good relations between Syria economically and lots of other states. But Turkey have an interest in Syria because they see...
It's a historical interest.
It's not just a historical, it's geographic interest. It's one which has been portrayed from hundreds of years ago, throughout the time of Ottoman colonization, even until now, where Turkey wants a Syria which is under the hegemony of Turkey, where Turkey can do what they want in Syria, where Turkish industries benefit more than the Syrian people, where Turkish companies and Turkish non-state actors, economic actors that is, essentially making millions from Syria.
Exactly. Mr. Danny Mackie, expert in international relations, thank you very much for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you too for watching us. Goodbye.